Hello, Muslim friends of the world. Monday, February 17th, 2025, became an unforgettable day for everyone in Detroit. The city, usually surrounded by the quiet of winter snow, was now hit by a storm much larger than they had ever imagined. Since the morning, the sky was dark with black clouds piling up, as if signaling the arrival of a disaster. Suddenly, strong winds began to blow, accompanied by heavy rain pouring down, soaking every corner of the city. However, even more terrifying was the sudden appearance of a snow tornado coming without warning. The entire city was wrapped in a deadly cold wind. Flooding began to strike the main streets, with water overflowing from the drainage systems, submerging everything in its path. Even houses began to flood. Amidst the storm, St. Joseph's Church stood firm in downtown Detroit, an old church that had been the spiritual center for many people for years. Reverend Thomas Daniels, known for his steadfastness and devotion, was leading a service at the church that morning. The congregation, despite the bad weather, still came to worship. They knew that, in the tension of the coming storm, the church was the place they would find peace. However, as time went on, the weather worsened. Thunder rumbled and lightning struck trees around the church, making the atmosphere even more terrifying. Outside, the winds began to spiral with unmatched speed. Reverend Thomas, standing at the altar, began to feel an odd unease, as if something was wrong. The roar of the wind grew louder, urging them to hurry outside. But it was too late. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the church, and the lights inside began to flicker. Someone screamed, "Tornado!" Snow tornado. But before they could run, the window panes shattered, and the church's roof began to groan, as if it could no longer withstand the incoming storm. The walls, once strong, began to crack, and debris began to fall. Reverend Thomas ran toward the church's main door, trying to guide the congregation out. But the path to the door was already blocked by rubble. The rush of flooding water only added to the difficulty. In an instant, the church, once filled with prayers and hopes, became a place of chaos and darkness. The space, once peaceful, was now filled with cries, screams, and fear. Thomas embraced a woman who had fallen, trying to provide comfort amidst the chaos. "We will be safe," he said, though he himself was beginning to doubt. "Hang on just a little longer." However, as he and the others tried to escape the nearly destroyed building, they heard an even louder sound, a sound that signaled even greater destruction. The snow tornado, growing more violent, swept away the heavy roof of the church, heightening the tension. In an instant, the entire church collapsed, and the storm seemed to swallow everything in darkness. Reverend Thomas woke up amidst the debris of the collapsed church, his body lightly bruised, but his heart was hurt deeper. He felt the weight of an immense loss, but more than that, he felt an emptiness he had never experienced before. The surviving congregation members ran towards safer places, but everything seemed so hollow. The church, once a symbol of hope and protection, was now just a pile of rubble. Thomas looked around. He saw many people fallen, crying and screaming in fear, but some were praying. They tried to find shelter, but there was no place that was truly safe. He felt the cold wind seeping into his bones, as if it were creeping into his soul, shaking the steadfastness he had once held. Amidst all this disaster, only one thing sounded clear in his mind. Why? Why did this have to happen? The snowstorm eventually passed, but what it left behind was more than just physical ruin. It was a deep destruction that not only destroyed the church, but also the faith of many people. Reverend Thomas stood amidst the remains of the shattered church, looking grimly ahead, thinking that the world had changed, and perhaps his life would change forever. The days after the disaster passed in darkness. Detroit, wounded by the unexpected storm, struggled to recover. So did the survivors, including Reverend Thomas Daniels and his congregation. However, while their bodies were safe, their souls remained trapped in the chaos left by the snowstorm and floods. Outside, the snow still fell, but the silence that followed the storm felt far more frightening than the earlier roaring winds that had shaken the city. St. Joseph's Church, once a bustling place of worship, was now just a memory. The surviving congregation gathered in temporary shelters, and though they were together, the sense of loss and uncertainty crept deeper into their hearts. Reverend Thomas, once a strong leader, now felt as if he were stranded in a foreign world. He walked through the flooded streets of Detroit, his mind filled with unanswered questions. What was the meaning of all this? Why did this disaster have to strike those who were innocent? Why did the church, which had been a place of refuge for so many years, have to be destroyed? As night fell, Reverend Thomas sat in the empty room that had once been used for worship. His mind was restless, turning in confusion. He began to feel that his long-held faith was now shaken. There was an emptiness inside him that he couldn't explain. What did life and faith mean if everything could be destroyed in an instant? He tried to pray, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. The prayers he had always offered for others now felt like empty chants that couldn't answer the doubts consuming him. Everything he had once believed about God, about faith that brought peace, now seemed so distant. Meanwhile, the surviving congregation members also felt the same unease. Many began to lose hope. They gathered in shelters, talking to each other, but their conversations were no longer about miracles or hope. They spoke about doubt, loss, and how the world they knew seemed to have changed forever. A few days after the disaster, Reverend Thomas received a message from Imam Iman, a Muslim religious leader who lived not far from the church. Imam Iman, who had been known to some of the congregation as a kind and wise figure, invited Thomas to come speak with him. At first, Thomas hesitated, but he knew that he needed something to help him out of his confusion. One dark evening, Thomas went to Imam Iman's house. The house was simple but warm. Imam Iman welcomed him with a calm smile, as if he already knew the heavy burden Reverend Thomas was carrying. "Reverend Thomas," said Imam Iman gently, "the snowstorm that hit Detroit did not only destroy the church, it also destroyed many hearts. But perhaps this is the time to ask, to seek, and to understand more deeply." Thomas sat before the Imam, feeling uncertain and not knowing where to begin. He sighed. "I no longer know what to believe. I wonder why God allowed all this to happen. I don't know what to say to my congregation, what I can give them to help them through this." Imam Iman listened attentively. When our lives are turned upside down, we often begin to feel loss. But in Islam, we are taught that every trial is an opportunity to draw closer to God. God does not want us to suffer, but He wants us to find peace, even in the midst of disaster. Thomas bowed his head, trying to digest those words. But how can we know that what we believe is true? How can we know which way to go? Imam Iman smiled with peace. Every religion has its own way of leading people to truth and peace. We all, at heart, seek the same thing: peace in the heart. Sometimes that search leads us down unexpected paths. All teachings speak to us of love, sacrifice, and peace. That night, their conversation lasted for a long time, with many questions asked and many answers shared. Reverend Thomas felt something deep and calming in the teachings of Islam that Imam Iman explained. There was no pressure, no force, only wisdom that made Thomas's heart feel a little more at ease. After that night, Thomas's feelings became mixed. There was a sense of calm beginning to take hold, but also a growing doubt. He felt trapped between two worlds, the world he had always known and a new world that had opened his eyes to things he had never considered. In the morning, while praying alone amidst the ruins of the church, Thomas felt the cold wind entering his body. The wind reminded him of the darkness of the storm that had just passed, but also of a light that was beginning to seep into his heart. He realized that his spiritual journey had just begun. The surviving congregation members also began to feel the desire to seek deeper meaning. Some began to follow in Thomas's footsteps, speaking with Imam Iman and opening their hearts to explore new paths. When they started to question the truth, their answers may not have been clear, but one thing was certain: the search had just begun. That morning, the air was still cold after the great storm that had devastated the city. However, there was a change that could be felt, not only in the weather, but also in the heart of Pastor Thomas. He sat in a small room, usually used for worship, surrounded by the ruins of the destroyed church. The surviving congregations slowly began to gather again, but this time not for a regular service, but to discuss something much greater: the search for meaning in their lives after such a disaster. Thomas felt that his congregation needed more than just comfort. They needed answers to the questions that shook their hearts about God, fate, and life after such a great calamity. He felt that this was where their true journey began. He had met with Imam Iman several times, delving deeper into Islamic teachings, and each time the meeting took place, he felt a peace he had never experienced before. In their discussions, Imam Iman patiently explained that every religion has the same core, to bring its followers closer to God, but the ways to achieve that peace were different. Pastor Thomas, Imam Iman said one evening, "In Islam, we are taught to seek peace, not only in prayer but in our daily lives. Everything we do, even in suffering, should bring us closer to God." Those words echoed in Thomas's mind. Every time he tried to reflect on what had happened after the disaster, he increasingly felt that his previous faith was no longer enough to provide the answers he was searching for. He felt torn between the faith he had inherited and the understanding he was gaining through his meetings with Imam Iman and the teachings of Islam. One day, after discussing further with some members of the congregation who had begun to be interested in learning about Islam, they decided to visit a local mosque. The simple mosque was nothing like the grand church they were used to visiting, but there was something different there. As soon as they entered the mosque, they felt an unexplainable calmness. The atmosphere inside wasn't filled with ornamentation or symbols, just a spacious and simple room. In the corner of the room, another imam greeted them with a warm smile. The imam, named Imam Karim, invited them to sit and talk. "This is a place to learn, not just to worship," he said, his voice gentle, filled with wisdom. One by one, they began to delve into the teachings of Islam as taught by Imam Karim. They learned about the 5 pillars of Islam, about prayer, almsgiving, fasting, and pilgrimage. All new concepts to them, but so easily accepted by their hearts. Every time they discussed these aspects of the teachings, Thomas felt that something was different. There was a peace that he had never felt before. In their prayers, although they didn't fully understand all the meanings behind them, they felt a closer connection to God. One night, Thomas pondered alone at Imam Iman's house after spending the day in discussion. Light rain began to fall outside, and the cold wind reminded him of the night after the great storm. "Imam Iman," Thomas said with a hoarse voice, "why do I feel such peace in these teachings? Why do I feel more connected to God here, even though I thought I already had everything in my faith before?" Imam Iman looked at him wisely. "Sometimes in hardship, we are given the opportunity to see beyond what we know. You have not abandoned God, Pastor Thomas. You are simply seeking a deeper way to know Him." Those words seemed to open a door in Thomas's heart. He felt as though he had been reborn, finding new meaning in his search. What he had found was not just a new religion, but a way to understand the world and God in a more peaceful manner. He began to open the Quran that Imam Iman had given him and started reading it more carefully. Every verse he read felt like an answer he had long been seeking. On the other hand, some of the congregation members who had previously only listened to Thomas pondering in silence began to feel the urge to understand Islamic teachings more seriously. They joined in studying the Quran and felt how the teachings provided a new perspective on the world and life. Many of them felt a connection with the principles of Islam, which taught balance between the world and the afterlife. A week after they visited the mosque, Thomas and some members of the congregation gathered again at a temporary shelter. They spoke with great enthusiasm about the teachings they had learned. Thomas felt as though he had just opened a new chapter in his life, a chapter filled with a deeper understanding of himself, God, and life. However, despite all the peace they felt, there was an unspoken feeling that troubled them. Was this truly the path they were meant to choose? What would it all mean for those who had been so loyal to their Christian traditions? Their families, friends, and loved ones would surely be shocked if they knew. Yet deep in their hearts, the peace they felt while reading the Quran, while praying together, was stronger than any fear or doubt. "This journey is not over," Pastor Thomas said, looking at his congregation, who had now become his companions in this journey. "But we have started a new path, and we will not turn back." That night, they decided to meet again, continue learning together, and keep searching for the way to true peace. They knew that although this journey was full of challenges, they had already found something very valuable, a peace that could not be replaced by anything. Week by week, the deeper exploration of Islamic teachings brought significant changes to Pastor Thomas and his congregation. They began to feel a peace they had never found in their former lives. However, the deeper they delved into these teachings, the greater the feeling that disturbed them, an internal division between two worlds. Thomas felt his confusion deepening. On one hand, he felt that the spiritual journey he was walking with Imam Iman and the other congregation members brought genuine peace and a deeper understanding of God and life. On the other hand, he still felt tied to the Christian heritage that had shaped him for many years. One dark evening, after a lengthy conversation with Imam Iman about what he was feeling, Thomas finally decided to speak with his congregation. They gathered at the temporary shelter in a room filled with anxiety, waiting with pounding hearts. "My brothers and sisters," Thomas said, his voice trembling, "we have been through so much together since the disaster. We have delved into teachings we never imagined before. We have found peace within ourselves, but also fear. Fear of change. Fear of what others might think if they knew what we have learned." The congregation listened attentively. Some of them shared the same concerns. They knew this was a big decision, one that could change their lives forever. But they also felt that this journey was something inevitable, something they had to take. One member of the congregation, Sarah, a young mother who had recently lost her husband in the disaster, stood and spoke with a voice full of doubt. "Pastor, I feel peace here, with the teachings we've learned. I feel as if I've found a peace I've never known before. But I'm also afraid that my family, my friends will hate me if they find out that I am considering following these teachings." Thomas looked at her with deep empathy. "I feel it too, Sarah. We all feel it. We are caught between two worlds, two beliefs. This is not an easy decision." There was a brief silence before Imam Iman gently interrupted. "This decision is difficult, but what's more difficult is continuing to live in confusion. Sometimes to find the right path, we must dare to take steps even when we are afraid." Thomas gazed at Imam Iman, feeling that those words captured the dilemma he was experiencing. However, he knew that this journey was much more than just choosing a religion. It was about self-discovery, about finding true peace, and more than that, it was a journey toward the truth. A few days after that meeting, as rain began to fall again in Detroit, Thomas sat alone in the church room that now lay in ruins. He opened the Quran, which he had read many times before, and continued reading the surah that taught about submission to God. Every word in the holy book seemed to fill the emptiness he felt within himself. He felt that although this journey was hard, he could no longer close his eyes to what he had learned, yet fear still enveloped him. He remembered his distant family, his old friends who had always supported him in his Christian journey. What would they think of his choice? What about his faithful congregation, who might not understand? All these questions troubled his mind. The next day he met with an old friend, another pastor who had once been very close to him, Pastor Samuel. They met at a quiet little cafe, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. "Thomas," Pastor Samuel said with concern as he noticed his friend's troubled face, "I've heard about what you've been doing, about your meetings with Imam Iman, about what you've learned about Islam. Are you really sure this is the path you should take?" Thomas looked at his friend with weary eyes. "I feel peace, Samuel. I feel closer to God. I understand Him better than I ever have before. But I'm afraid. I'm afraid of leaving the belief I've held on to for so long. What will people think? What will happen to my congregation? They'll feel betrayed." Pastor Samuel sighed deeply. "You know, Thomas, I understand your search, but don't forget what we've taught. We believe in the Almighty God. We believe in Jesus as our Savior. Are you sure you're ready to let all of that go? What is it in Islam that you can't find in Christianity?" Thomas fell silent. His friend's words kept him awake much longer that night. Could he truly let go of everything and follow a new path? Did that mean betraying what he had built all these years? Meanwhile, some members of the congregation, who were more open to Islamic teachings, began to feel stronger in their faith. They delved deeper into the Shahada, prayer, and the obligations of Islam. They felt an immense peace when they prayed together, read the Quran together, and discussed the meaning of their lives. Yet doubt still haunted them. Would they be accepted by the outside world if they followed this path? Were they ready to start a new chapter in their lives, even if it meant facing tough challenges? That same night, as the cold wind blew again, Thomas stood before the church, now reduced to ruins, gazing at the dark sky. He knew that the decision he was about to make would not only affect him, but also those who followed him. He felt torn between two worlds, but one thing was certain. This journey had brought him closer to the truth, even if it meant facing greater challenges ahead. Is this right? Thomas thought to himself. Is this the path I should choose? A path that leads me and my congregation to true peace? And in that moment, in the stillness of the night, he felt as though the answer was beginning to open before him. The days following the disaster grew increasingly tense for Pastor Thomas and his congregation. The decision to delve deeper into Islamic teachings was not an easy one. They felt torn between two worlds, the old world full of memories and the new world they had discovered after the great disaster that struck Detroit. But beneath all the fear and doubt, there was something stronger, the peace they found in Islamic teachings, a peace they could no longer find in their former lives. On a bright morning, Thomas walked alone toward the mosque where they often gathered to learn. His heart and mind felt lighter than before, though the fear of change still lingered. He knew that a big decision awaited him, one that was not only about him, but also about his faithful congregation, who had been with him through many struggles. At the mosque, Imam Iman greeted him with a smile full of understanding. "Pastor Thomas," he said softly, "today is an important day, not only for you, but also for many who have followed this journey with you." Thomas nodded, though his heart was filled with concern. "I feel peace in this journey, Imam. I feel closer to God, but I'm afraid of what will happen next. Is this the right path? Am I ready to let go of what I've held on to all this time?" Imam Iman placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, offering deep calm. "There is no easy path, Pastor. But with every step we take to draw closer to God, we find a greater peace. This path is not about changing who we are, but about rediscovering who we truly are before God." Outside, the congregation members who had survived the disaster began to gather, many of them appearing calmer and more confident. Some of them had already taken great strides in their spiritual journey, beginning to read the Quran with greater attention, starting to pray and worship in a new way. They felt closer to God, more certain that the path they had chosen led them to true peace. On one afternoon, they gathered at the mosque to discuss the next steps. Thomas stood before them, looking at faces full of hope and doubt. Everyone knew this was a turning point in their lives. They were not only discussing religion, but also about the changes that would lead them to a new life. "My brothers and sisters," Thomas said with a voice full of conviction, "we have been through so much together. We have faced storms, we have felt loss, but we have also found true peace in these teachings. I do not know what is coming, but I know we cannot go back. We have found a path to God that is more loving, more peaceful." He paused for a moment, gazing at the faces of his congregation. They looked uncertain, but there was also a sense of acceptance beginning to grow within them. "I know this is not an easy step," he continued, "but I am sure this is the path we must take, the path that leads us to true peace. I am ready to follow this path, together with all of you, and I want you to know that you are not alone. We will walk together, even though the challenges ahead may be great." The room fell silent. Some members of the congregation began to shed tears, feeling relieved and moved by Thomas's words. They knew that this decision was not just about religion, but about renewing themselves in their lives for a better future. One by one, the congregation began to express their feelings. Sarah, the young mother who had lost her husband, stood and spoke with a slightly trembling voice. "I have never felt more at peace in my life. I feel that I am no longer afraid of loss because I know that Allah is always with us. I am ready to walk this path, and I will not turn back." Other members, who had once been hesitant, now began to feel more certain. One by one, they expressed their desire to learn more about Islam and to embrace this new path with open hearts. At the end of the meeting, Pastor Thomas led them in prayer. This was not the usual Christian prayer he used to say, but a more universal prayer, one that came from their hearts, grateful for having found deeper peace and truth. They prayed together, asking for guidance from God, that they might be given the strength to walk this new path. A few months later, the congregation members who survived the disaster decided to attend religious classes at the mosque, studying Islamic teachings more deeply. They began praying together, sharing knowledge and living in harmony. They no longer felt torn between two beliefs, but felt whole in their new journey. Pastor Thomas, now known as Ustaz Thomas by many, felt that he had found his true home, not just in Islamic teachings, but in the spiritual journey that had brought him closer to God. He knew that the big step he had taken had changed his life forever, but he did not regret it. On the contrary, he felt more at peace and more certain in his heart than ever before. One day, as the sun began to set over the horizon of Detroit, Thomas sat on the mosque's porch, gazing at the city that had tested and shaped his life in so many ways. He felt that their journey was not yet over. There was more to learn, more to do, but for the first time, he felt sure that they were on the right path. "This is the beginning of a new journey," he said quietly to himself, feeling calm and full of hope.